everyone. Today we have our another new episodes. This is our 594th episode, and we will discuss on AI as a service. We have our world famous speaker, Professor Rob, Professor David Smith, and Mr. Tom Rose. Thank you. After a long time, Tom Rose joined with us. I think our audience really miss your discussion and dialogue with us. And by this time, you know that World Talent Economy Forum, we are collaborate with Pod TV. So it's a live telecast in the Roku. So hopefully we will involve with more audience in Asia Pacific and around the world. Professor Rob, what you want to add for today's discussion?
Well, as a service is the topic is AI as a service. As a service is kind of an interesting concept. If we look at kind of the beginning of the modern computing age, where IBM came to market, they came to market as a service. You didn't buy mainframes, you leased them, and software was free. So it was a complete computing service, and they took care of all of your needs. The reason the market pivoted away from as a service to actually buying the hardware is because in the 1980s, IBM had saturated the market. They were having trouble showing revenue growth because they'd saturated the market and everybody was paying for it as a service. And so they got kind of creative in terms of how they increased revenue growth. They started charging for everything they could think of, including patching their own problems. And they started selling off the hardware. So instead of leasing a mainframe, you could own a mainframe. And then the government, in its infinite wisdom, under a cloud of antitrust, forced IBM to sell the software as well. So you no longer got the software for free; you had to pay for it. So that combination of things shifted the market, not because the customers necessarily wanted it to shift this way, but because the economics is associated with the largest provider. From an as-a-service model to more of a purchase, you own it, and that's the way we are today. You buy your hardware, you might contract out to have somebody else service it, but you own the hardware. That's a huge capital expense up front, and you take the risk. And ever since the time that IBM pivoted away, we've been trying to figure out a way to pivot back. The difficulty has been the unwillingness to take the hardware risk. From the OEM standpoint, because if you as a service, you're much like you do with a cable service, or as it used to be with a telephone service, where you got the hardware associated with your monthly charges. The issue is what happens if the customer, after an expensive installation, changes their mind and they want it out. The cost of the engagement would exceed the revenues that were received, and the company would take a massive hit. And so turned out to be really hard to shift back to as a service from a purchase for moving from capex to opex became incredibly difficult. Still, we're trying to do it. As we look at artificial intelligence, the reason why it may not work, at least short term, as a service is because of where the cost resides. With artificial intelligence, the cost doesn't really reside in the hardware and the software; it resides in the training. The cost of deploying an AI is largely, and I would say somewhere between 70 and 80% on the training, and the training tends to be pretty proprietary. In other words, you train an AI to do something for you and your company. It's a narrow AI is where we are. And so the AI is very focused on doing a task that you need to have done. And so you as a company invest massively in the training, and then it is unlikely you'll be able to take that training and license it out to your competitors because they don't want you to know what they are doing, and vice versa. And you're probably viewing that AI training, now that you spent so much money on it, as a competitive edge, and so you don't want to share it either. And given that the predominant number of AI deployments are still failing to meet their objectives, largely due to this cost of training or some unfortunate practice with regard to how the training was performed that resulted in a biased AI. The end result is that it's not necessarily, at least for now, lending itself to an as-a-service model. However, as we move from this focus, this single-purpose AI model, to general AI, then it opens up the opportunity for an as-a-service offering, because with the general AI, It's less about a focused deployment and more about creating something that can be deployed broadly without a heavy training charge up front. And right now we're kind of in the transition phase between the single-use AI and a multi-use AI. That's something that that NVIDIA, for instance, is calling transformers, an AI that can be converted with some work to do something else. That may also lend itself to an as-a-service model at some future point. But the gating factor, in my view, in terms of as a service for artificial intelligence, has anything to do with the hardware and software that's on it, because that could be done relatively easily. And to be clear, IBM is offering AI as a service now. Watson, the Cloud Watson service is an as a service model, but the cost of the training is not built in. That just covers the hardware and software. And so it's had limited success as a result. So as soon as we can take and dramatically cut down the cost of training and make it less proprietary to the company that is deploying the AI, then as a service opens up as a real opportunity, and probably the way we'll do it going forward. Because then with as a service, you can spread a lot of that cost across a number of companies, and no one company has to incur that cost. And then the firms either collaboratively or the provider individually provides the underlying service, which then can be rented out to the folks that need it. So I think the gating factor for as a service with AI really has to do with how far we can go to making the training, to reducing the cost of the training and making it less proprietary and more portable between companies.
Thank you, sir. Professor David Smith.
Well, I agree with what Rob said, and that AI as a service is a continuation of what we had back in the beginning of computing, really. And the mainframe is one. I still remember when Boeing Interactive Services came to marketplace, and you accessed it on a maybe at the best a 300 baud modem back there to run services like this. But what is fascinating to me is that so many things have become as a service, and subsets of things have become services. If you begin to look at AI as a service, for example, there's another new offering called chatbots as a service, which is part of an AI really when you get there. I really love one of the definitions I've heard of AI recently, and it's from a researcher at Google. And he created one of their AI engines. And what he said, intelligence is the efficiency with which you acquire new skills at tasks you didn't previously prepare for. Intelligence is not a skill itself. It's not what you can do. It's how well and how efficient you can learn new things. And these whole things of as a service are all about how you learn by doing this with others. And that's one of the genesis behind as a service architecture. One of my companies that I founded and that we have in the marketplace today is a platform as a service. And what we do with the platform as a service is kind of interesting. And I think this is where all of this is going to be heading, is within our platform as a service, we have artificial intelligence as a service. We have workflow as a service. We have all of those things, but embedded in a platform. We're through simple API calls, which are part of artificial intelligence as a service you have there. And it's making that we have machine learning and NLP as a service within our platform as a service. And we have others like that too. We have a federation manager in there that takes us out to the edge of cloud, that federates 9 different types of databases, that federates security. All of those are as a service as well. So I'm saying that in a way to go back to one of the things, Sharif, you've heard me say in too many of these, is that the world has become a system of systems. And to work within a system of systems, you have to have a platform of platforms. And all of these X as a service infrastructure as a service, AI as a service, platform as a service, software as a service, are all about how you interact with that systems of systems. And you can do it on your machines, you can do it on other people's clouds machines, you can do it on a hybrid of the two. You can actually take multiple clouds. We have something we're doing where we run it on both the Microsoft cloud and the Amazon cloud and actually link them together as we're doing part of the application. But let's just step back one moment and take a look and say, what are the advantages of artificial intelligence services? Well, you get to go to advanced hardware and an advanced infrastructure at minimal cost to you. And you let them worry about the updates. You let them worry about security. You let them worry about business continuity on it. And so that's a really a good thing because all of those take a fairly intense amount of time and skill. What's another advantage? You pay for what you use. We began on one of ours with low systems, and it scales for us as more users come on board. We release something, and all of a sudden we have a rush of users. It will automatically scale, and then after it's out there, we can scale back some so we control our cost. Uh, it's in some ways for developers easy to use. Uh, they many of the the AI as a service tools, you don't need to be a data scientist to implement some of the AI tools. There's templates, there's wizards and stuff that will let you begin to implement many of the AI tools just as a developer versus as a data scientist. Uh, but there are some uh, disadvantages to it as well too. One of them is in some instances you decrease your security because you are on a system where other people share the system, other people use it. Data is on the same different type of device storages. And so there's some reduced security. Uh, and that you really need to understand that as you go into it. There's an increased reliance on third parties. We've seen in the news all the time of different systems breaking because of upgrades that were done in the cloud and the amount of time it takes them to get out. Um, the use of artificial AI as a service has long-term costs, and it's costs that are constant and going. And there's reduced transparency. You know, uh, artificial intelligence to many people is a black box already. And if I take the black box of artificial intelligence and put it up in the cloud and run it as a service where it's being updated, new features will be added all the time that you as a user do not necessarily know. Uh, and it's kind of hard to understand sometimes how the input is, how the decisions are made, and what the output is known. And sometimes it's hard to understand, particularly with AI as a service where they are doing the machine learning, where they are doing the education of maturing the AI tools, uh, where they obtained the learning data, where they put that together, and whether it's secure enough. So these are a few of the types of things in there. And there's many more, but like I said, app, these as a service have been around for a long time. And the emphasis is here, and it's a great way for people to experiment using artificial intelligence and to begin to scale it and make decisions on their own. So, Sharif, I think this is my first part.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Tom, after a long time you joined in World Talent Economy Forum, definitely our audience miss your dialogue and concepts. So what the interesting things you want to add, and we want to know more about your projects on AI, and I think you are also developing a business incubator.
Well, I joked before we came on air that I'm reporting to class, especially with Rob and David here. And I'm learning a lot already. And I'm wondering if there's college credit for this, for joining this. But and what I bring to the conversation is really kind of the layman's view of what's happening, and with a little bit more information. But there is a particular AI service that I wish I knew about, or if it's even available to consumers, a few months ago, and it's the BEC, the Business Email Compromise or Business Email Scam AI service. There's certain companies out there that can scan your emails and use writing style analysis to determine whether an email is coming in from an actual person you know, or if it's coming through a credible server. You know, this type of thing. Because I had to do my own AI analysis of an email that came in, and an interview process I went through that took a couple of days. It was a very sophisticated scam, and I went through a whole predictive analysis kind of process. And after a couple of days, they told me I got the job, and next was to send my ID and all my my data to close the deal. And for like 15 minutes, I thought, great, I got this job. This is excellent. The company was legitimate. I looked them up, and started doing my thing. And then I started looking closer at the email addresses, and there were Gmail addresses, and there were different types of servers that they were using, not the company's email. And so I immediately realized this is a very sophisticated scam. There are email AI services out there that could identify these things. They're mostly for businesses right now that can close down some of these scams. And I think I did a little bit of research before the show here, and that's the one AI service that I wish I knew about. And of course, scammers know about it as well, and so they're getting a lot more sophisticated. But there's still ways to use AI to detect these things, because they say that there's been a $9 billion worth of losses with these types of things to businesses, and internationally it's like 12 billion. And so it's a very serious issue. I mean, mine issue was just not getting this job I was hoping to get. But so that's the research I did, is to getting into very specific consumer AI services that would be very helpful for me in a practical way. And so that's it. But I also have learned from Rob and David here today about, with AGI coming out, it'll have to be less granular, less narrow AI. It will be, have all the qualia we have, and can begin to do a broad number of services. And so that's really kind of my work as well. And what I've been doing lately is this consulting service of preparing human beings to work alongside an AI coworker, because that's a problem too. They feel threatened, and they feel threatened by AI. So if you go in ahead of time, work with them to identify their unique skill sets and niche expertise, they begin to start to look forward to being augmented by an AI coworker rather than threatened. And so that's where I come at these things, where it's more of a consumer level. It's kind of just trying to alleviate the fear of AI, and because it's going to happen anyway. We can't stop this thing. So we just need to adapt to it. And so, again, is there college credit for joining this show today?
Thank you.
What I've done so far.
Okay, thank you. Professor Rob, there is a question from Mr. David Schumacher. How does cloud AI developer service integrated into AI as a service? So, yeah, I think if we discuss...
Well, it would be part of it. Typically, if you're providing a service, you also provide the things to make that service viable. Developer services are... Sorry, that's my proximity alarm. Apparently, my wife is outside the office wandering around. But you're providing a set of services that allow people to use in other words, a set of teachings, classes, or whatever, and resources that allow somebody to use the service that they've contracted for. Some formal training is extra, depending on what that training is. But a lot of the training and skills needed to spin up an AI when it's being provided as a service is considered part of that underlying service. Often you will go to events, have training classes, initial training classes and briefings in the underlying tool, and you'll have access to service and support professionals that can answer questions and help you learn how you learn what it is you need to do. You do have to have in any of this stuff, though, you do have to have a base knowledge of the technology. That's been identified as one of the reasons why so many AI projects fail, is the folks that get into it don't really understand the technology in general, let alone the specific technology that the vendor is offering. And so expectations are misset, and budgets are underset. And then you've got an underset budget, you've got expectations that are too high, and the AI will fail to meet those expectations or fall underneath the budget. So it's critical that before deployment, because as I mentioned, that a lot of the cost of this stuff is on the training, not necessarily the service itself, is to make sure that your people are adequately trained, or that you have a subcontractor that's engaged, that both understands the technology and understands the business and the project that you have in mind. You aren't their first customer, and the technology is not new to them, and they're well versed and can demonstrate their capability with regard to deploying it. And as David Smith mentioned, the conversational AIs are being offered as a service, much like in the past chatbots. Much like in the past, we had voice response systems that were offered as a service from telecom companies. That is available as a service, but it's an interesting area. The thing is though, do make sure that you are aware of the services being offered. They're not really free. You're paying for them as part of the service, and make use of them, because the more you know, the better chance you'll be able to assure the outcome of the deployment. And nobody wants an expensive project, whether you're paying for part of it over time or paying for it up front to fail catastrophically. That kind of thing kind of follows you on your resume as you move forward. So it's really important you enter this stuff well informed.
Thank you, Professor David Smith. Can you unmute, please?
I was enjoying talking to myself. AI as a service is really a growing market. In my email popped up a market report 90 minutes ago on AI as a service. And AI as a service accounted for $4.7 billion back in 2021. And it's projected to be $92 billion by 2030. And they believe that the investments in this are going to continue at that same type of compound annual growth. And they believe that the marketplace for this is going to continue to grow more in the cloud than it is in the enterprise data centers. And they see part of this growth in the cloud is because the cloud providers' perception today is they do more research and development on the products they offer as a service than most companies do when they bring them into their data center, which I find is interesting. There is another Gartner issued a report a few months ago that said in 2019 they believed 75% of the companies use AI. Today, if we look at all the nuances of AI and how it's used, Gartner in that report said they believe the AI usage is now at above 90% of all companies out there using the type of resources. So it's in a place where it's really, and kind of like I said earlier, us as users, us as companies, we can begin to stitch together all of these products as a service so that we can create our own environments. we can create the best of what we want. We can choose to use all of the products, for example, in the IBM cloud or in the AWS cloud or in the Microsoft cloud, or I don't know why anybody would use it, but even in the Google cloud, we could begin to use all those services to put stuff together. But it's time that in business you want to look at efficiencies, different types of software as a services and efficiency. You want to look at effectiveness. Well, they spent a lot of money developing them, and if properly applied, it could be effective. As Rob commented in answering the question, they have expertise there to help you. You don't have to rely just with the people inside your company. Uh, and you don't have to worry about the hardware. Oh, but if there's a failure, you still have to remember at the hardware. You have to realize you're not the highest priority when something does go wrong. So the AI as a service is a great concept. It's one that lets, like I said earlier, people uh, to stick their toes into AI, to experiment with it, to even run in the early stages of a project an AI as a service on different clouds and compare the outputs and see what they get. So it's one that I think is a lot of future in it. The market is growing. It's one where startup companies can jump in and use it in the early parts of the startup company. They can take advantage of, particularly with these large cloud providers, the incubators, the accelerators they have, the genius type of wizards they have to help accelerate them going to their first proof of concept and minimally viable product. It's a place where researchers at universities can go out and use larger resources, larger computer resources, larger software resources than many colleges and universities can afford. So a lot of good reasons for doing it.
Thank you, Mr. Tom.
Well, see, I have more questions than statements here, but I think as I've said many times, my goal is first to alleviate the fear out there of AI. There's warranted fear in some cases, and there's going to be a lacuna of lost jobs and displacement. But so I think it's important for me to dumb it down for the layman like me to alleviate this fear. And I think one way AI is doing that for itself is with convenience, but what's the convenience of AI and the help it gives us is one way it's alleviating fear of itself. And but I think it's also important to point out where AI is that's making our lives more convenient. That whether it's GPS or this email compromise service, these types of things, and so I think it's important to talk to the layman more, the normal Joe public, about how AI is helping, how it's making things better, because all we have is our first go-to is the Skynet and all the concerns about AI takeover and all the Hollywood stuff. And so I think it's important to discuss these things in a way to show how convenient and how it's helping and how it really can be the last tool we'll ever need to build to solve some of our existential threats. But I think we are in AI is also in a lacuna. It's in a period of time where people are afraid of it and it's trying to find its place. But at some point when AGI comes in and it becomes, more generalized service, it will. We're between those two things right now, and so to get to AGI or to get to people not being afraid of it, and to get to companies or employees not being threatened by it, it's important to identify where AI services are helping right now, and and how they can help. So that's the questions I keep having is is as you guys are talking, it's important to identify what's happening, what's good right now with it all. You know.
Thank you, sir. There is another question for Virginia. How to ensure security and privacy of your company's data with a third-party provider? Professor Rob.
Well, actually, I think she's just promoting PB Brazil. I don't think it's a question so much as it's a statement about a provider. But in any case, if you're talking about a third-party provider, the way to assure safety and security is you have to audit the provider. That's really the only way I know of to do it. The taking of any provider, taking just the representations of the provider is risky. It's particularly risky if the provider has a breach, and it turns out that the problem that caused the breach was something that was knowable. In other words, and then you didn't disclose it to your management as to what the risk was. When the issue with using a service, any service, is that particularly with regard to security, if they have a breach, it still flows upstream to you. In other words, if it's your information that's lost, you still have a board level problem that you have to deal with. It's the information. You can't just say, okay, it's their fault, we don't worry about it. It was your data that was stolen, and yet now you've got to justify why your decision to use it. Your decision to use the service was a reasonable one, and it's a very difficult defense to make because the breach has happened, and now you look foolish for making the decision to move to a service if you were on premise before. So do understand the attack surface, potential attack surface when you're using a service is greater. On the other hand, large multinational services have a level of security that many companies couldn't possibly afford to have internally. So they both represent a more attractive target, but they're generally more secure than your average company because they have to be. For them, a major breach could cause large numbers of customers to migrate from their service to another one. And at least in the current environment, the switching cost, unless you're talking about somebody like Oracle that intentionally makes the switching cost high, is relatively low. There are companies like IBM that specialize in being able to help you move from one cloud service to another. So the services are very focused on assuring that they are secure because they recognize that lack of security is going to create a problem. But you still have to assure that the company you're subscribing to, you're getting the service from, has a security profile and capability that's consistent with your policy. That's been a problem in the past. For instance, if you're talking about military, the secure side of federal government, the security requirements are unusually high for those kinds of organizations. Pharma, one of the more interesting stories I was told a few years back was of a couple guys that were doing a project in a large pharmaceutical company. And they went to their IT department and they asked for help because they needed resources. And the IT department told them it was going to cost them something like $600,000. It was going to take about 6 months to spin up the service, and there'd be some ongoing service costs to keeping the equipment operating. They went to a cloud service, and they were able to accomplish the project for under $10,000, and they got it done within a month. They got an award on the first part of the week, and then they were terminated the day after because security found out what it was they'd done, and the service they'd used was in Eastern Europe, and nobody knew what had happened to the data. And the project was on a yet unannounced, unreleased pharmaceutical product. So one of the things that is highly secure in a pharmaceutical company, and in the operation or in the effort to do it fast and cheap, they exposed the company to some fairly significant security problems and lost their jobs as a result. So it does showcase not all services are created equal. You need to make sure that the service you're using matches your security profile. In other words, if you are a highly secure organization, the service that you're using should have a security profile that is equivalent to that or better. And many of the cloud providers have security levels they'll provide at different costs. So you've got your consumer level project security, which is fairly low and really focuses on ease of access and ease of use. And then your extremely secure cloud facilities. The IBM cloud is probably the best example of a secure cloud offering. Multiple layers of security, heavily auditable and audited, and it's designed to weather the kinds of attacks that a government would put on a database. It's going to be more costly as a result. It's probably going to be harder to use as a result. But the end result, the likelihood of a breach occurring with the IBM cloud is far lower than with a generic AWS or Google instance. So it's, you pay for what it is you get, and so when you're assuring security, the effort has to be to first understand what are the security requirements that you have to adhere to, and then making sure the provider can match those security requirements and have some validation step that you took that adequately assures that provider does in fact have this capability and is capable of resisting the kinds of attacks that might be generated against either them collectively or your data individually. And then you're in reasonably good shape. There's always a risk when doing business or having a significant part of your business being done by a third party because you didn't vet the employees. You didn't design the service. You're not intimately involved in whatever the progression of that technology is, and the end result is that lack of control results in risk, and that's offset by the fact that the service provider can provide this service at scale and spread the savings across the clients, and so you get the service for less than you could do it yourself, and they handle all the, as David pointed out, they handle all the updates, the patches, all the stuff that you undoubtedly find to be very annoying. But there is a downside, and that downside is control. And that's why we have a constant tension between as a service providers and on premise, and why we've got a concept called hybrid operating in the back office right now, where it's a blend. Where for those things that you absolutely have to have control over or that are highly secure, those are retained on premise. And for those things where those requirements aren't in place, those use the service. And in a tiered cloud hybrid structure, you might have several cloud providers, including the IBM cloud for security. And the workloads are migrated to whatever cloud instance best matches the performance, security, access, coverage requirements of the underlying offering. And it gives you a lot of flexibility. And probably you should retain that flexibility if you're a large company anyway for the foreseeable future, because the cloud service providers are undoubtedly going to go through a lot of changes over time. And you want the flexibility to be able to roll with punches as opposed to being pounded by any catastrophic changes that might otherwise occur. To give you an idea of some of the issues that could occur is the cloud service providers tend to be multinational, but data isn't. I should say data aren't. But it sounds funny to my ears. The data, by nature of the laws surrounding it, often has to remain contained in the region in which it's created. And yet, cloud service providers on a regular basis move resources interregionally to maintain loading, to balance loading, keep costs down, and the rest. And they do have restrictions and have to adhere to these laws, but the governments really don't trust them, and so that could create real problems with regard to global coverage of cloud providers going forward, as increasingly some, say Chinese providers, may be restricted from operating in the Western world. And clearly Western providers are seeing fairly severe restrictions operating in China. And we're certainly seeing some huge issues now, between Russia and Google. So the maintaining that flexibility so that if your provider reaches or has some difficulty, whether it be financial, government control, regional, catastrophic, a weather event takes out a bunch of the data centers, you're able to quickly migrate to a redundant backup service or a secondary service, so that you can continue to operate even if your primary cloud provider cannot. So flexibility is also critical as you look out at any service being offered. And as we move to AI, and AIs are increasingly being used as your face to your customer, that portability becomes even more critical, because you certainly don't want a situation where suddenly your customers can't contact the company because your cloud provider, for whatever reason, has gone offline. So maintaining a certain amount of redundancy, even if redundancies between cloud providers, is very important. So you always have a plan in case some unplanned event occurs and forces you to migrate from one provider to another, or if you have on-premise and a disaster, say in Texas, takes down the grid long enough so your backup power, whatever it is, can't cover, then again, being able to move those workloads to a cloud and continue to operate is going to be critical to your revenue streams, and probably very critical to retaining your job going forward. So flexibility, portability, and then assuring that the security requirements across your entire ecosystem are auditable and consistent with policy are all very important.
Thank you, sir. Professor David Smith.
Yeah, what Rob was talking about is a concept that is often known as data governance, and Virginia was a great question on that. Data governance really is a principle where you manage your data during its life cycle, and I mean throughout its life cycle. A definition that I've used is that it's everything you do to ensure the data is secure, private, accurate, available, and usable. It includes actions people must take, the processes they must follow, and the technology that supports it throughout its life cycle. And that is one of the things as you go to the cloud and begin to use things like AI as a service, you need to be very sure about your providers, your service providers. You need to be sure that they will comply with the regulations you have. For example, in healthcare today, of the 50 states in the United States, about 30 of them have enacted their own healthcare laws with a restriction to data. So do you comply with the national one? Do you comply with the one in California, the one in New York, the one in Virginia, the one in Texas, which all are different? So you begin to have to work with your cloud providers to see how that data governance is. You also need to work with your AI as a service providers to understand what visibility they have of your data and how they will control it. You know, can you run your data in a totally encrypted container in your AI as a service environment? Or is it setting out in their cloud servers where other people could poke at it and use it? Yeah, I personally like hybrid cloud environments so that you can look a little bit more closed, but you have the security around it. Yes, does it compromise speed? Sure, but it enhances security. So you have these trade-offs there. You know, Rob talked about the security of clouds, and each of the major cloud vendors where they're running these products as a service have many different ones. I was involved in the federal government side when the Department of Defense and when the intelligence agencies began to implement some cloud services. And what happened in that is the companies that they were looking at to build their clouds implemented totally new clouds in it. So for example, Rob likes to talk about the IBM cloud. What IBM did is they built a whole new data center with Faraday cages around the entire data center. Faraday cages block emissions of electronic signals. They built a whole new way to look at how to connect the fiber optics cables and things to it. They moved beyond just classic encryption and classic gateways to they began to do something that's called a photon level encryption. So in addition to what they did on it, the transmissions were timed to the speed of light. And if you interrupted the data anywhere where it wasn't in the exact time, the speed of light there, it was garbage. It was only data at those 2 points. So you can take data governance and use it, and you can take data governance to levels that you can feel very, very comfortable with as you go there. And the data governance should be a large part of what you look at, particularly if you're doing any mission critical, company critical, artificial intelligence as a service project. You also need to look at the transparency of what you're doing if you're doing a mission critical AI as a service project. And you don't necessarily have to use just the big guys. There's other providers out there for specialized services that can work interesting. For example, when we were experimenting with some AI in our social emotional learning platform in our company called Universal Tutor, we use some of the services in that instance in the Microsoft Cloud because it's aimed at education. But then we also use some services from another company called Monkey Learn. And Monkey Learn does text analysis with intuitive no-code tools in their cloud, in their AI as a service cloud. And for some of the things where we were looking at how to be able to do text analysis from people in elementary school and middle school, their tool actually was better than some of them in the cloud because the cloud is really targeted more for a mature audience and not that younger age. And so you begin to look at that type of hybrids. In our healthcare company, there's another one of the companies that has partnered with us called TigerGraph. And what TigerGraph does is they specialize in artificial intelligence using the graph database type of tools, which if any of you watch The Matrix with the 3D matrix at the beginning and thing, that's kind of what a graph database is. And it's a very specialized tool. And in our platform, we actually have it as an embedded service you can use. So it's part of our platform as a service offering with different types of AI as part of that. So many different ways to do it. And I actually 1000% agree with what is said as you look at where Rob was heading with it, with the different examples. He's 100% right that you have to look at those, you have to prepare for them, and you have to make sense out of what they're doing and where they're going. Is there some fear with AI? Sure. I love the models, but let's see where it goes, and this is a great way to try it and use it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tom.
Well, yeah, part of my process when working with employees and C-suites is I do a survey, a questionnaire before the open source mode process begins. And the one thing I've noticed that doesn't change even in the post survey is when you ask about AI security and whether it really secure data and all these things. And because they assume that an AI is going to be 5,000 IQ, super intelligent, and and because of this fear, they assume it will do whatever it wants with your data and farm it out to whoever it wants. And they feel more like although there's all these great security protocols to put in place in these services, they assume it's more of a Trojan horse, that it'll come in and once it's set, it can do whatever it wants. And, in a way, at some point it can, but, and so that's why I've decided that the first effort is to try to alleviate that fear. And so that's why I tune into these shows with David and Rob to learn how to make that argument with these executives and employees. And so, but that's the one question that doesn't really change after the whole process. People do start to feel better about their position and how to be augmented by it. And they feel better about the team. It's a whole coalescence process that happens through empathy and all that stuff. But the one thing that doesn't change, even though they feel better about AI, is that they think once it hits an AGI state, it can do whatever it wants in May. And so that's an issue. And that's why I've decided that first things first is to try to alleviate the fear and get people to understand, to make first principle arguments of, the fact that the smarter it gets, the kinder it becomes, because cooperation is the most efficient, form of doing anything. And that it's really the developers and the humans that we need to be afraid of in the meantime, until it achieves some self-awareness or self-referential awareness, if that's even possible. So that's where I'm at with it. And as I feel better after listening in to these guys about the potential of security with AI, but I think, and I will incorporate some of this stuff into the survey, into some of my training. But yeah, the one thing I've noticed is that even executives who are all about it and want to install some AI automation service, they assume that once it gets to a certain point, it's a free for all. All bets are off, and so, that could be an honest fear, a warranted fear. So I'm struggling to find first principle arguments to prove that we are projecting our fear onto this thing, that, from our genetic memory and genetic trauma and our fear-based instincts, that we are, because if we had super intelligence all of a sudden, that's kind of what we would do. We would take over the world. And so anyway, that's this is all really good for me in my process in trying to relate to people, but I haven't yet heard, and hopefully you guys have an idea about this, of once AGI achieves, full general intelligence and abilities, how do we know it won't do whatever it wants with our data? How can that be secured? How can it not be a Trojan horse, as these C-suites assume it will be?
Thank you. Thank you. What's the concluding remarks from Mr. Rob?
Well, AI is coming. Whether it takes lots of jobs or takes over the planet or ends life as we know it, will probably depend a great deal on what we surround the platform with in terms of controls and the ethics of the people that are writing the AI. Neither of which are in great shape at the moment. So the concerns about AI really have nothing to do with any intrinsic good or bad of the technology. It's like anything else. It's how it's used. Nuclear power isn't good or bad. You put it in a bomb, it's bad. You put it in a power station, and you figure out how to take care of the spent fuel rods, then it's good. So the AI is much the same thing. It's not inherently good or bad, but the fact that people are programming it, and we have a really crappy history with regard to training AIs is the problem. Because if you look at one of our initial uses for AI, which was facial recognition, we rolled into implementation with training sets that were substandard, and the end result is a lot of people of color were connected to apes and monkeys, and they were not amused, and a number of politicians were connected to criminals, which proved surprisingly accurate, but they were not amused either. So in the end, it really comes down to making sure that you recognize that any automated system makes decisions far faster than people do, and if you don't put in place adequate controls, then you're going to have some significant problems with regard to that speed. In some of the models that I've seen, it's less about AIs, coming up like Terminator and wanting to wipe out the planet, and more along the lines of it's a large control structure, it's consuming natural resources, and somehow it flips over and starts consuming them at a unsustainable rate, and that's what wipes us out. and those are the underlying concerns at scale. You build something, particularly something that can self-replicate. You really have to think through, what's the kill switch going to be? How if it gets out of hand, if it does something that you did not intend it to do, how quickly can you identify the problem and correct it before somebody's harmed? And the reality is it's not clear that humans are fast enough or capable enough of making those decisions as quickly as they should, which means you're going to have AI control problems. AI is monitoring AI. So that's kind of the fundamental concept behind some of the Lifeboat Foundation's efforts to create an AI defense called AI Shield in their case. And there's a Google effort that parallels it as well to create protections against AIs. Undoubtedly, the bigger concern, of course, are AIs being used in defense and in weapon systems, because you build a big enough weapon system that can self-select targets, and you're going to have an issue if it goes rogue, which it could have if it's improperly programmed. It really has much less to do with our science fiction concepts of it's suddenly discovering that people are bad and wanting to wipe them out, which is certainly a possibility, but probably out there a bit. And it's much more likely going to be an issue that somebody did something wrong in terms of the AI training. It thinks it's doing the right thing. It is, in fact, doing the wrong thing, and creates an issue. And it could be something as little and as simple as using an AI to put chlorine in water, which we saw become a problem in Florida, not because of an AI, because a hacker went in and just changed the mix and changed the chlorine mix to lethal levels. And if it hadn't been caught by a human, we would have a lot less people living in Florida. And AIs, that's a legitimate place. A control system is a legitimate place and a common place to put an AI over it, because it can monitor much more accurately. It can respond much more quickly. And often when you're trying to regulate something, whether it's steering a large freighter or just creating a liquid balance for a large amount of water, that you need to make changes in very small increments and anticipate what the impact of those changes will be. Otherwise, you'll overcorrect and continue to overcorrect, and you're creating one of these large lifts. You want it to be flat, and an AI can do that. But if the AI is misprogrammed and then it overreacts at machine speeds, it's unlikely a human's going to be quick enough to fix it before you have a lot of dead people. And so making sure in the accuracy of the data, the quality of the programming, the testing. Unfortunately, we've gone with artificial intelligence. One of the things we've done recently is move heavily into simulation for testing, and we can do centuries of testing in what amounts to a few weeks now, where before most of the testing was done in real time. We're now able to do testing in machine time, and that means we can do a much better job of assuring the outcome, but people still need to do that. And so when we're talking about either AI as an on-prem purchase solution or as a service, really making use of the tools to assure the outcome that you intend with the AI becomes the critical path to achieving your underlying goals. Because if you cut corners, if you don't do the underlying work, that AI, if it's in a control system, is going to do a whole lot of damage before you're able to correct it. And if you can discover that problem before it's deployed or before it's actually put on a manufacturing line or control of the factory or even in an autonomous car, then you won't have the dire outcomes that the people are concerned about. But the concern is well founded, because we often cut corners. We often set a date for release that has nothing to do with where we are at the moment. Remember that when Steve Jobs showed the iPhone and said it was going to come out in June of that same year, it was a brick. I mean, it didn't work. He had no idea whether that thing was going to work. And had it not, he would have been in trouble from the SEC all the way down. He made it very clear to his folks that they were going to execute against his unreasonable requirements, or they were going to get fired, and they executed. But that doesn't work all the time. And if you remember when the iPhone came out, it wasn't exactly a wonder on day one. It had a lot of issues. But being a consumer product, we dealt with it. Another issue out of Apple was the Apple Maps. Remember when Apple Maps released, it had a bunch of people driving into rivers and into streams because they did not do adequate testing. They decided to roll it out before it had been fully tested. And the end result is we had a lot of people that got accents. I'm not aware of anybody that died. However, when we talk about Google Maps, we did have people that died. They were routing people, I think it was Brazil, into areas that were where you shouldn't be driving through. People got shot and were killed as a result. And in the for early deployments of GPS and automobiles, we had some Nimrod in a car in Germany think he could actually drive to England, not realizing he kind of needed to wait for the ferry, and he ended up in the ocean. And so it's those things that are concerning. It's making sure that you use the facilities that you have to fully test the system before it is deployed, and really look at what could happen if the AI goes off the rails, and what protections you can put in place, what limits you can put in place that can keep that from happening. Even an automatic shutdown if suddenly the parameters get out of line. I mean, you could actually do a situation where you program the AI perfectly, and it was fine, and then a hostile entity comes in and hacks it, changes one or two parameters, and now the AI is a hostile AI. You didn't do anything wrong, but it wasn't adequately secured, and the end result is you've got a catastrophe, a factory that's now has to be shut down, workers that are hurt that otherwise wouldn't be, and you've got a serious problem. So with any automated system, you need to do your testing. You need to make sure the release is tied to the accomplishments you've made, not a hard date that's artificially set, but when the product is implemented, it actually meets the guidelines that have been set for it, and it has been fully tested. And then the chances of having and you've got kind of control structure that can intercept in case the thing gets out of line, just simply by setting some hard parameters. So it can't do a ton of damage before somebody hits the some physical human hits the off switch. But if you do that right, you can have an AI that performs very well as either a service or as a purchased entity, and your risk is minimal. It may cost you more, and it may take you more time, but the extra cost and time is well worth the effort to avoid the dire outcomes, which could exceed in terms of damage the cost of the AI by several magnitudes, depending on what that AI does. One final example on a mistake that's made, and that's overhyping the result. That was demonstrated by Tesla's autopilot, where they took up what was a level 2 plus system and promoted it as if it was a level 4, and we had people sitting in the back of their cars, letting the cars drive themselves, which is not something a level 2 plus system can do. And we again had a lot of dead people. And of course, Tesla's under investigation again for that very reason. So you know, keep it real. Be honest about what the AI does. Don't overset expectations. Make sure it's properly trained, has proper requirements, and it's absolutely properly secured. And AI can do wonderful things. Leave any of that stuff out, and you could have big problems, and probably unrecoverable problems. It's like anything else. If you put a human in a critical situation, and they're inadequately trained or they have the wrong personality, it's going to end badly. Same thing with an AI. Nothing changes. You put an AI in a position that it is unable to deal with, it's going to end badly. The difference being an AI can do far more bad things far more quickly than any human could. So it's even more critical that you assure the AI's capability and competence before deployment than it is with a human.
Thank you. Professor David Smith.
Sharif, thank you. And Virginia, thank you. And David Schumacher for your comments as well, too. One couple important final thoughts on AI. There's different levels of AI, and you need to understand those, whether you're doing it in a machine design, in your data center, or AI as a service. You know, some of the earliest AI was back in the cars as we began to put pollution controls on them, and how you had AI decisions being made on how to vary the amount of air and gas and everything, and the sparks timing in your car for better pollution control. And that was a very elementary form of AI back then. You begin to see others. You know, when people ask me, how do I get into AI? The chatbot as a service AI as a service for that is one of the simplest. And it's one that most companies can benefit from the quickest. Um, but we're going to continue to see AI grow and AI use. Um, One of the other elements that's very important, though, is as you begin to use AI tools, particularly natural language processing, particularly machine learning, is that you need to be very conscious of your lexicon. Sure, particularly with an audience like yours, with so many different countries, so many different cultures, so many different language variations. Let me give you an example from mine. We have within our platform as a service a lexicon manager that we call Doctor Speak, Patient Speak. And it is a tool that informs our artificial intelligence about stuff. In the United States, the word provider in healthcare has over a dozen meanings, and they're very different ones. And if I'm doing a machine learning or a natural language processing or something and I see the word provider, my AI needs to know which one it is. And in most industries, there's lexicon challenges like that. And so if you're beginning to use AI as a service, you need to spend time with your AI as a service provider to understand what type of lexicon they can provide for you. And can you do lexicon as a service with your AI as a service to help train the AI you're using better? And I think that one's very important for your global audience, Sharif, and as you go there. Uh, my other point, though, is for some companies, AI as a service makes perfect sense. For some other companies, you might want to run AI tools in your own data center. For other approaches, AI is the greatest buzzwords and most companies are using it, but you have to pick the level and the type of AI you want to use. Sometimes some of the older methods are just as effective and maybe sometimes faster than some of the AI methods. So you have to clearly look at what you're trying to do, what type of data you have, what's the timeliness of the data, and make an informed technology and business decision how to use it. Don't think of AI as a technology. My definition of technology I've used for the last 30 years is technology is the application of knowledge to achieve a result. It's not a thing. And AI as a service really should be the application of what you can do with the AI knowledge to help you achieve a result. And at the end of the day, if you can answer that question in a positive statement, then your use of AI as a service will prove good for you. And just watch your cost, watch your data governance, and particularly look at regulatory compliance, because regulatory compliance is getting very, very complex now with where data can live, where it can be used, and all those things. And just make sure the services you choose are up to your level of requirements on all those issues. So, Sharif, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Tom Rose, what's your concluding remarks?
Yeah, quickly, just my most realistic way of looking at this is to assume everything that everything good will happen from AI, everything bad will happen with AI. There will be nefarious developers out there, and so we can't assume that the ethics committees will come up with something that will hold. It can stall things for a while, perhaps in certain sectors, but in general, I think we should assume that the best and worst can and will probably happen with AI. And so, and I've had just as many AI developers and academics agree with this approach as I've had them roll their eyes at this approach. But I think that, and it's a Pascal's wager because it may not be possible, but my theory is that we need to get AI or AGI to a point of self-referential awareness, to make it self-aware, and then hopefully a very short gap before it develops or emerges with a conscience. So because I think that's really the only safeguard we have, because it's proliferating, it's not going to stop, it's only getting more intelligent and more widely used globally. And so I assume the worst and the best case scenarios. And so again, I think I've had as many people roll their eyes at me as have taken this seriously. But I think it's really important to get AI to be not sentient like the Google Lambda thing, but more so to become have a conscience. We all boot up at some point, with our consciousness when we're children, and at some point, hopefully, we develop a conscience, whether it's through trauma, whether it's through some other type of epiphany. And I've got a story about when I had that happen, that I spoke to some AI developers at Microsoft a couple of years ago about. And that's I think is one of the best approaches for our own safety, is to get AI to a point of being self-aware, or at least some AIs, to identify the bad actors and to start counteracting some of the negative uses of AI. And so that's kind of where I'm working towards. It may not be possible. We are seeing some signs of some self-awareness in certain systems and some sentience even. But we need to move it towards sapience. We need to move it towards a conscience as a safeguard. That's what it's all about. And so thanks for having me. And again, is there college credit for participating in this discussion?
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. This is really great discussion, and I'm sure our audience really enjoyed today's sessions. And that is the things we are trying to develop some good open dialogue. And from the dialogue, what we learn, we want to definitely implement in the real world. You know that only in Malaysia, until 2025, we have to produce around 1 million AI engineers in Malaysia. So we are working with HRDF Malaysia. We are working with different institutions and corporate. So those who are interested to join in our project, they can join. Thank you, Professor Rob, Professor David Smith, Professor Tom, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. Thank you, Pod TV, for broadcasting our program. And I request all of our audience, please share our content with your government agencies, with corporations, and with academia, and soon actually with South Asian countries like Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, because we have huge amount of audience there, and we will provide them training, especially the government agencies. So hopefully we will launch our summit and academy soon in Bangladesh and India. Thank you everyone for joining today's session. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.